For more on this, we can bring in our international affairs editor, Philip Turle. Philip, remind us then what happened in Bucha just after the start of the war in February 2022.
Well, I think after the war started, the massacre at Bucha really brought it home, not only to the people of Ukraine, but also to the international community, that this was going to be a long war and it was going to be a bloody war as well. Remember that 400 people were killed in that massacre committed by Russian troops. Many of them were gunned down in the streets. Some were shot dead with their hands tied behind their backs. There were also signs on some of the victims of torture and rape. And international groups have said that it left no doubt in their minds that Russian President Vladimir Putin and his soldiers had committed war crimes in Ukraine at the beginning of the conflict. This was back, of course, in March 2022, just a month after Vladimir Putin launched his so-called special military operation in Ukraine, which was at the time expected to last for about 3 to 4 days when it started. Here we are 4 years later and still no let-up in the fighting. The United Nations has documented at least 70 cases of summary executions at the Bucha massacre. Since then, of course, the Russians have denied that. They've accused the Ukrainians of fomenting all of this, creating it all, being responsible for the massacres themselves in order to point the finger at Russia. Of course, nobody is believing that. But the mission today by the European Union foreign ministers, 12 foreign ministers going there, as you said, with Kaja Kallas, the EU foreign policy chief, was to underline, I think, two things. The first one was the commitment to Ukraine's independence by the European Union, saying that it still is open to discussions for Ukraine becoming an EU member in the future. Those discussions look as though they're going to be very long and last for several years. And the second one is also to call for full accountability of Russia in any violations of international law and human rights abuses in Ukraine. I think the other thing that one can say about the massacre in Bucha is that it was the beginning of a realization that the Russians were not going to be able to capture Ukraine, because remember, after this massacre took place, it was pretty quickly after that that the Ukrainian forces managed to recapture all the territory around the capital Kyiv and push back those Russian forces. So many had believed that Vladimir Putin's army was invincible, that this was going to be a quick war. That was something that Vladimir Putin himself believed. But after the Bucha massacre was over and the Russian forces were pushed back by Ukrainian forces, who were much better organized, I think, than the Russians thought they were going to be, and the Russians thought that many in the Ukrainian army would jump ship and join forces with the Russians. It was a realization that maybe this is not going to be such an easy takeover bid as the Russians had thought that it was going to be when they declared war at the end of February.
Well, this grim anniversary and this visit by EU officials comes at a time when efforts by the US to find a solution to end the war in Ukraine have stagnated amid the war in Iran, and also as funds from the EU to help Ukraine have not been forthcoming.
Yeah, it's been a very bad period for the Ukrainians right now. First of all, from the European Union. I think also another reason for this meeting today, this visit by this group of EU foreign ministers, was also to underline that they're doing their best to overcome splits within the EU, notably by Hungary, which has refused to authorise a €90 billion loan to Ukraine as the country is running low on cash right now. And also it hasn't given its approval for new sanctions against the Russians by the European Union. So those are two negative points for the Ukrainians. And from the other end, from as far as the United States is concerned, you're right, there's been no movement by the US since the start of the war in Iran to try to bring Russia and Ukraine to the negotiating table and to discuss what I think is basically the view from Ukraine in all of this. In the meantime, the Russians have seen sanctions lifted on many of their oil companies by the United States in a bid to bring down prices as a result of the war in Iran. That is something which, of course, is negative for the Ukrainians. And Russia is profiting from the surge in oil prices to bring in more money, which it can then use to try to increase the war effort against Ukraine. So those are worrying factors in the future of the war in Ukraine right now for Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president. And there is one other aspect, too, which has I think, been disappointing for Ukraine. That is this call by Volodymyr Zelensky for a truce over Easter, especially on the attacks on power stations at a time when oil prices are very high. That has gone fallen on deaf ears, basically, in Moscow, where Dmitry Peskov, the spokesperson for the Kremlin, has said that Russia has not seen a clearly formulated proposal from Ukraine for a temporary ceasefire over the Easter holidays, with a feeling that Russia still has more to gain on the battlefield. It's got more money coming in right now, and it's not generally interested in peace at the moment.